been the Director of Common Cause since 1996, 20 years this February. I think in large part that's because I would not be able to get a job anywhere else. I've made too many enemies around the state over the years. But it's a job that I love. It's a passion that I love. Chuck mentioned if you can find a liberal Republican, let us know. And I was such an animal growing up. I grew up in Ohio, and in Pennsylvania we were what we call Rockefeller Republicans growing up. It just happened to be that's my neighborhood, and those are the people that I grew up with. And but it was a very different Republican Party back then. It was a party that very strong on civil rights, for instance, and never engaged in voter suppression because the Republican Party back then was trying to attract more people to register to vote because they thought their ideas were pretty good at the time, and they were. I mean, Eisenhower was not a conservative. I mean, there were a lot of folks that weren't, and we weren't either, but the evolution over the years was pretty striking. I did work for, when I graduated, by the way, I graduated from Miami University in Oxford, Ohio. It's the only thing that Paul Ryan and I have in common. we both graduated. What's funny about that is that it's kind of a conservative school in Southern Ohio. It's a beautiful school. It actually made me a very staunch progressive because I did have some of those professors that the conservatives always talk about that had a way of changing my way of thinking about the world and challenge some of the assumptions about the United States. I think it had maybe the opposite effect on Paul Ryan, and he was apparently reading a lot of Ayn Rand back in college. It's not something I ever read. The books were, first of all, too thick. So, in any event, that's where our differences lie. But I came to Wisconsin in 1988 in part because I had worked in Washington, D.C. for a member of Congress. I had been the legislative director. He was a Democrat. I'd also helped him get elected. And it was a very tough district. It was one of these districts where every year, it's what you call a swing district. Something, by the way, that we don't have in Wisconsin anymore. Almost every district, every congressional district is now utterly safe. There's no competitive districts in the state of Wisconsin anymore. And only 10% of our state legislative districts are even remotely competitive. Everything is safe because of gerrymandering, because of redistricting, and particularly because of what the Republicans did in 2011. They gerrymandered the state in such a way that they would have control of the assembly, most certainly, until at least 2021 and perhaps beyond. And that margin, as you know, is pretty stiff right now. It's 62-37 Republican, which is a big margin. But I worked for this Democratic congressman in the suburbs of Philadelphia, and my job during election time was to raise money for him. So I kind of understood very quickly the connection between money and elections and the influence that it had on, oh my gosh, and here's Representative Deb Colstein. Nice to see you. Thank you. I better watch what I say.
I came to learn.
As long as you don't heckle me, that's fine. So my job was to raise money for Congressman Kosmeier every 2 years, and we're talking about $750,000, $1 million to put on Philadelphia television, which is very expensive. And I also realized the very real connection between the money that I would have to raise for his next reelection and kind of the strings that sometimes were attached to that money. It wasn't pronounced, but it would certainly made you think a little bit about whether or not you were going to oppose a certain group who was either A, going to give your candidate some money for the next election, or B, might run money against you. And it's something that was common in every congressional district, and even much more so today. And it's something that has happened in the Wisconsin legislature in the time since I've been in Wisconsin. And that is that this money does have an influence on the public policy making. Certainly started to in Wisconsin when I moved here. And to give you an idea about the money situation, in the 1986 gubernatorial election, when Tommy Thompson defeated Governor Tony Earl, who, by the way, is my political mentor, the guy that hired me at Common Cause, and I think one of the most decent people ever to serve in public office in Wisconsin. Real shame that he was not elected to the United States Senate in 1988. But Governor Earl and Tommy Thompson engaged in a campaign that together, combined, including outside spending, was under $3 million for the two of them. In contrast to the $83 million that was spent, we think, could have been higher in 2014, most of it by Scott Walker and his allies, but certainly a considerable amount by Mary Burke as well. And I had moved to Wisconsin to get away from what I thought was that money corruption in Washington, D.C. And I worked in the legislature, and I saw that it was enveloping this state as well. And so when I became the Director of Common Cause in 1996, it was right at the time when two very different types of leaders took over in Wisconsin as head of the legislative Republicans and Democrats. The Democratic leader of the state Senate was a guy named Chuck Chvala, who many of you have probably heard of. He's from Madison, very progressive, very bright, very hard-nosed liberal. And then Scott Jensen, who had served as Governor Thompson's chief of staff and then was elected to the Wisconsin Assembly in 1991 and quickly rose up through the ranks and became Speaker in 1997, but really was the political brains of the Republicans beginning about 1995. And those two really changed the tenor of Wisconsin politics. Politics in Wisconsin in the legislature before then had been it's competitive, and there were certainly arguments, but people always came together at the end and sought compromise and worked for the benefit of the citizenry of the state. Chvala and Jensen had a very different view. They viewed politics as a blood sport, and winning at all costs was the goal of both of them. And I'm being tough on Chuck, but in fact, he was just as guilty of the scandal that plagued Wisconsin as Scott Jensen was. It was both political parties. And that led, as you may remember, in the early 2000s to the eruption of the legislative caucus scandal. And the scandal was about the leadership holding fundraising events in the Capitol, using staff to use equipment in the Capitol, shaking down lobbyists for campaign contributions. In the case of Chuck Chvala, running an actual issue ad group out of his office in the Capitol and raising special interest money to fund that entity. And the eruption, the investigation, took about a year and a half. It was uncovered not by the State Elections Board and the State Ethics Board, who are our watchdogs at the time, our government agencies. It was really discovered by a reporter for the Wisconsin State Journal, a person by the name of Dee Hall. And she happened to overhear a Republican state representative talking about the caucus doing work for them for his campaign and what the caucus was doing. And she quickly realized what he was talking about was the Republican Assembly caucus, which was working in the Capitol. And that led to a whole series of investigations, really by an investigative journalism, the Wisconsin State Journal, later the Milwaukee Journal-Sentinel. And it was really those folks that uncovered the scandal. And the scandal was considerable. In June and October of 2002, the top Democrats in the state, in June, Senator Brian Burke, who was the Democratic chair of the Joint Finance Committee, the most powerful committee in the legislature, was charged with 18 felony counts. He was running for Attorney General. And what he was doing was he was bringing lobbyists into his office in the Capitol. And they would talk to him about stuff that they wanted to get through the Finance Committee. And then he would purposely get up and then move to another chair. And then he would say, okay, now what are you people going to do to help me get elected Attorney General? And so it was a pretty direct quid pro quo. And this was something pretty shocking in Wisconsin because we'd never really seen this before. And then the same thing happened throughout the summer and into the fall of 2002 when, in two successive days in October, Senator Chvala, the Senate Majority Leader, was charged with 20 felony counts now, including extortion, bribery, misconduct and felony misconduct in public office. And the top 3 Republicans in the Assembly, Scott Jensen, the Speaker, Mickey Foti, the Majority Leader, and Bonnie Ladwig, the Assistant Majority Leader, who, by the way, had a young staffer working for her at that time by the name of Robin Voss, were all criminally charged with felony misconduct in office. In the case of Bonnie Ladwig, it was misdemeanor. But nevertheless, this was pretty shocking because this had never happened anywhere else in the country. It never happened in New Jersey or Pennsylvania, where I cut my political teeth, states that you might expect to see something like this. It didn't happen even in Illinois, where you'd really expect something like this to happen. It happened in Wisconsin. And it was the only time that you've ever had the simultaneously criminal charging of a Republican and a Democratic leadership team on both sides of the aisle. And it was because of that scandal that we created the Government Accountability Board. You were wondering why I was going into all that detail about the caucus scandal. Well, that's why the GAB happened. I happened to be meeting with the former Senate Majority Leader, Republican Senator Mike Ellis of Neenah, who was at that time the leader of the effort in the legislature of both political parties for campaign finance reform. So I worked very closely with Ellis for a period of about 10 years. He was for public financing. He was for getting the special interest groups out of the elections to the extent it was possible. He was for even giving candidates extra money if these groups spent money against you to help protect the candidates. Because he was pretty fiercely independent, and he didn't like special interest groups coming into his office and telling him, here's what we want in the budget. He was a flinty conservative when it came to budget issues, and he didn't like special interests putting their teeth into the budget and grabbing their piece of the pie. So that was his motivation for campaign finance reform. That and the fact that he was also elected in 1970, and that was an era when we didn't have big money in politics, where really ideas mattered a lot more than money. And so he wanted to hold on to that. So Senator Ellis and I, and then we brought in some other folks, a woman by the name of Gail Shea, who was the founder of the Wisconsin Democracy Campaign. We brought in Senator John Erpenbach and some others, and over a period of 4 years, we crafted the Government Accountability Board to take over from the disgraced State Elections and State Ethics Board, who did nothing in the period of the late 1990s to investigate the corruption that was happening under the Capitol Dome. And the corruption was occurring over a period of time. It was happening basically from about 1998 to about 2001, 2002. A lot of this stuff was going on. And it's not hard to understand why the State Elections Board and the State Ethics Board didn't do anything. The reason, of course, is because the State Elections Board was comprised of partisan appointments. And who appointed those folks? The Senate Majority Leader, the Assembly Speaker, the Senate Minority Leader, the Minority Leader in the Assembly, the Governor, the Chief Justice of the Supreme Court, and the 2 heads of the political parties. So they weren't interested in applying the law to campaign finance, election, ethics, and lobbying law. They were interested in making sure that their partisan interests were represented. And so Ellis and I and others realized it made no sense to have an entity where you had partisans making the decisions. You had to have a nonpartisan entity. And the closest thing that you can find in Wisconsin to a nonpartisan are judges, retired judges in particular. And that's why the GAB was formed the way it was, with 6 nonpartisan judges. They all were subjected to a vetting process. They were then presented to the governor, and the governor could choose from a list of folks to appoint to the GAB. Then they were subject to approval in the state Senate. And here's the part that the Republicans in power don't like to mention, and that is that there were 2 things that we had to do in order to get this passed. One of them we hated. I hated it. And the whole deal almost fell apart. But one of the things that they insisted on, the Republicans, was that, okay, we'll vote for this GAB, but in return, there has to be a provision in the law that says that we, as legislators, and this only applies to legislators, if we are caught or investigated and indicted with our hand in the cookie jar in the Capitol in Madison, then we have the option of being tried in our home county, not in Dane County. Because what they said was, well, the Dane County District Attorney is always a Democrat, so it's unfair for Republicans if we are caught in an act of corruption. Now, this is, of course, something that none of us are entitled to. You know, I got a speeding ticket up in Eau Claire. I didn't have the option of contesting it in the Dane County Court. I mean, I had to go to Eau Claire. I didn't contest it, of course, because I was guilty as hell. But nevertheless, I'm just saying that any crime that you commit, you don't have that special exemption, that special privilege. And of course, one of the things we don't hear the other side talking about, as they now have come very close to destroying the Government Accountability Board, is also repealing this provision that allows them to be tried in the county of their home rather than in the county where they commit the crime. It's kind of a special little carve-out for them. And that's just another way of telling you that this process that we're involved in right now, that's happened in the state Senate last Friday night with the vote to destroy the GAB at 2:26 in the morning. I know that because I was there. I'm very tired. And that will again, as Representative Kolstein can tell you, will again be revisited in the State Assembly this Monday, when at considerable cost to the taxpayers of Wisconsin, the legislature, the Assembly will come back in extraordinary session to pass the destruction of the Government Accountability Board, and then also to put into place and enact into law sweeping campaign finance changes that will take Wisconsin from what used to be considered to be a pretty good system in terms of transparency to somewhere between maybe Texas and Alabama. So we're going to be really the least transparent state in the country in terms of being able to know where the money comes from, because of what they're ramming through this legislature. And so just to give you the whole picture in perspective, the three pieces of legislation that the Assembly Republicans and the State Senate Democrats decided to make the centerpiece of their fall legislative agenda had nothing to do with education, had nothing to do with economic development. You know, Oscar Mayer in my town of Madison just announced it's closing. 1,000 jobs are gone. SC Johnson Corporation in Racine just announced they're moving 150 jobs to Chicago. You know as well as anybody here in Janesville that I guess the final nail in the coffin for any hope of the GM plant ever opening again was nailed down fairly recently. So that will not happen. So there was no special session or no fall session on any of these matters, or for that matter, on the road, the transportation situation, and what can be done to repair our roads, which are, I guess, second to worst in the nation, I've heard. I don't know. But again, it was to pass 3 bills whose really, their real intention really is to simply cement in power the party that's in power. And they also do what I call, it's really the retroactive decriminalization of Scott Walker bills. Because what they've decided to do, and they've already done, is passed a law that first of all takes away the ability to use something called the John Doe process to investigate political corruption in Wisconsin. And I'll be very brief about this. The John Doe process is kind of unique to Wisconsin. It has been around since before statehood in 1848. And really, the reason it's used, most other states use the grand jury process. We use the John Doe process because it's a lot cheaper. It's a lot more efficient, and it's a lot more effective. It's one of the reasons why Wisconsin in the 1900s, up until 2002, the caucus scandal, was considered to be one of the cleanest states in the country because of the ability to ferret out political corruption. It has to do with the John Doe law. And the John Doe law is simply a judge in concert with a district attorney who can offer witnesses immunity from prosecution in return for testimony. And it's a lot easier to do that than it is to convene 150 people to come into a courtroom and then pick 17 jurors and then interview all those people and then pay them $17 a day or whatever it is and their costs. So counties in Wisconsin rely on the John Doe process in large part because it's inexpensive. If they had to convene a grand jury for every incident of political corruption, it would be very tough for them to do that because, as you know, nobody has the resources in this state. All the municipalities and county governments are starved for resources now. And so that would mean that political corruption would be a very low priority if the John Doe process is eliminated. Well, what the Republicans did, and I say Republicans because they are only Republicans. There's no Democrats that support this. There's no good government groups that support this. What they've done is they've crafted legislation which was signed into law, of course, on a late Friday afternoon by Governor Walker, that denies the use of the John Doe process just for political corruption. In other words, they list the crimes that you can't use the John Doe for. It includes extortion, bribery, felony misconduct in public office, misuse of public resources. These are the crimes that politicians would likely commit. But for everybody else, this efficient John Doe process is still in place, just not for certain sections of the statutes that apply to campaign finance, ethics, or elections. So that's very interesting, isn't it? So what they've done is, first of all, is they've gotten rid of the tool to investigate corruption. Next, they've gotten rid of nearly the tool or the government agency that is provided with the oversight, the enforcement power of corruption. And let me tell you what the GAB, what its power is. The power isn't the 6 nonpartisan judges. That's a good thing. But when we concocted this GAB, it was very important to us to make sure that the funding that came to it for investigating corruption not be controlled by the legislature. After all, in 2002, Senator Brian Burke, the Democrat from Milwaukee, was the co-chair of the Joint Finance Committee. If the GAB or the State Elections Board had to go to him to ask for money for investigating corruption in the Capitol, what do you think he would have said? What do you think he would have done? It was critical that we had an independent stream of funding that the GAB, this newly constituted Government Accountability Board, could utilize that was not at the whim and the control of the legislative leadership. That was the key. And so under the bill that passed first in the Assembly, then at the State Senate last Saturday morning at 2:26 a.m., and will be back in the Assembly, gets rid of that stream of funding. It replaces the 6 nonpartisan judges with 2 commissions, both with 6 members. Actually now the Ethics Commission will have 8 members though, 2 judges to please Senator Luther Olson, although it really doesn't do that much. But nevertheless, it'll be 2 panels of partisans. Democrats, Republicans, and the Republicans have made a big deal about saying this is good because Democrats will have the same representation on these commissions as Republicans. Yes, and here's how it works. If there's a 3-3 tie, which it will be on many, many matters, because you'll have partisan appointments, nothing happens on a 3-3 tie. There's no compliance, there's no movement forward, there's no move to investigate, nothing. It's deliberately designed to fail. It's deliberately designed after the Federal Elections Commission, which is also 3 Republicans, 3 Democrats, and is considered the most dysfunctional federal agency in the United States today. So that will be the watchdog, the government watchdog over our elections, campaign finance, lobby, law, and ethics. And that's the model that they've proposed, and that's the model that Representative Colstein and others will be voting with them on Monday. The campaign finance rewrite, and then we can open this up to questions. The campaign finance rewrite, Wisconsin for many years, again, considered a national leader in the area of campaign financing. By that I mean that we had a system in place that was pretty good in terms of transparency. Spending, contributions, of course, had to be disclosed. Outside spending, what we call independent expenditures, were disclosed so that people would know where the money's coming from. About 20 years ago, there was a loophole that was sort of opened up in the law that said that if you ran communications that didn't say explicitly vote for, defeat, support. In other words, if you had a communication that simply said something like, Chuck Ogg wants to destroy your schools, he wants to pollute your water, he wants to deny your children lunch. Call Chuck and tell him that's not good for Wisconsin. Well, that, if Chuck was a candidate for office under the election, at the next election, and that type of communication will run, because it doesn't say defeat Chuck Ogg or vote against Chuck Ogg. It's hard to say 4 times in a row. Chuck Ogg, toy vote. But because it doesn't say explicitly vote for, vote against, defeat, that type of communication is not subject to disclosure. I mean, that's what's called an issue ad, and you've probably heard of that. That's what's called an issue ad. And so for years, we have been working to try to close what we call that issue ad loophole, because clearly the Chuck Ogg is bad for your water and wants to deny your children lunch has the same kind of influence as an ad that would say defeat Chuck Ogg, he's a lousy guy. It has the same, in the minds of voters, it has the same effect, right? It's to deny him election or to support his opponent. But because it doesn't have those quote unquote magic words, we have been trying to pass a law that extends disclosure requirements to those types of communications. The reason I'm telling you this is that this is the heart, this is so important. This is so important, and I'll tell you why. Because if you allow that type of communication to go unreported, it doesn't take a genius to see that that's where everybody's going to put their money. Why would you run a communication where you have to disclose your name or you have to disclose where the money's coming from if you can run a quote-unquote issue ad against a candidate?